Canada's biggest airline is taking a big hit because of COVID-19. Air Canada is slashing up to 60% of its staff. That's about 20,000 workers. The airline posted a $1 billion loss in the first quarter and says it is burning through millions of dollars a day. Ashley Burke has more.
It's an industry enduring its darkest days. Now Canada's biggest airline's cutting more than half its workplace to survive.
It's definitely heart-wrenching.
The union, representing 10,000 flight attendants, says it's never witnessed such major cuts before.
It's going to affect single moms. It's going to affect people that have moved across the country. It's a huge unsettling position after many years with the company.
Air Canada's been forced to ground hundreds of planes across the country because of the pandemic and says it's losing $22 million a day. In a statement, the airline said it's cutting staff in order to conserve cash, right-size our business for the level of traffic we anticipate in the mid to longer term, and to position ourselves to rebuild once business returns.
That's why we're going to keep working with airlines, including Air Canada, to see how we can help even more than we have with the wage subsidy.
The government has put billions of dollars of financial support on the table, including a wage subsidy program that Air Canada has already tapped into to hire back thousands of workers. Trudeau also announced bridge loans this week, but it wasn't enough for the airline.
What Air Canada is really looking for is not the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that they've offered for other businesses, is looking for billions.
And what airline associations are looking for is a bailout like the U.S., saying it's the only way to survive and keep servicing remote Canadian communities.
There's a significant number of airlines that could just disappear. This is a tragedy for our industry because Canada is a huge country that relies a lot on aviation, and it really needs to have these airlines around to help connect people.
All of this shows the challenges that Air Canada and the rest of the country are up against. Today, Trudeau didn't rule out a bailout for airlines, but didn't rule it in either. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
Well, for more on this topic, we have invited Seth Kaplan onto the show. He is a transportation analyst with NPR's Here and Now and the author of Glory Lost and Found, How Delta Climbed from Despair to Dominance in the Post-9/11 Era. Seth Kaplan joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Natasha.
So, Seth, let's talk about when people can start flying again, hopefully whenever this COVID-19 thing is a distant memory. What do you think at that stage airlines will be like, air travel will be like?
Well, every crisis causes the industry to change. So it's only reasonable to assume that the biggest crisis of all, which is what this one is, will cause some of the biggest changes of all. Some we can anticipate, some we're not sure of, and probably some things that we can't even imagine right now. But, you'll get on a plane years from now and see some people wearing masks, even once, hopefully, this immediate threat has passed. The question is, social distancing. Airplanes and airports weren't designed for that. And so there are these questions in the U.S., for example, proposals to restrict airlines from booking the middle seat. Well, all that would provide would be, 18 inches of a room between two passengers, not the 6 feet or the 2 meters that are required for social distancing, and it would push up fares. So that's the kind of thing that, hard to say whether it'll happen, but all kinds of being talked about and all kinds of big impact on passengers if they do happen.
Seth, we're having a bit of trouble with the connection, but I'm going to try and keep the conversation going. Now, something that you said that stood out to me was when we start traveling years from now. Is that what you believe, that it's going to be years from now that we can start flying again, going on vacations again?
Oh, I mean, years from now, when the threat has hopefully entirely passed. No, look, at some point here, and look, the questions mostly depend on bigger questions in the airline industry, right? It depends on the course of the pandemic itself, after all. It depends on when there will be a vaccine. But there are signs that travel has at least bottomed out and is rebounding from its lows, but off a very small base. The question is going to depend on the individual, right? Some of us are more concerned if we're not particularly old or not particularly vulnerable, perhaps from an existing health standpoint. We're more concerned about other people around us on the plane, relatives we might visit when we get somewhere else. But then there's a percentage of the population that itself is those vulnerable people who, whether or not the middle seat is empty, that's not going to protect them. And so, as with everything else, I mean, this isn't particular to air travel, but as with the decision to go out to a restaurant or a theater or elsewhere, it's really going to depend on the individual's risk tolerance.
So, in terms of the culture and how things will move forward in the future, do you think we're going to culturally shift into not wanting to travel, at least travel that requires airlines as much? Or are we going to see a redesign of airplanes themselves and airports?
Yeah. Well, certainly non-essential travel, I think for a lot of people is clearly off the table for the time being. In the short term, yeah, you'll see people sort of going more toward cars, as they did in the post 9/11 era, especially in the United States, partly because of fear, but partly just because traveling by air had become more of a hassle. So that's something to watch here too. So those shorter trips where a car or a train is an option, those are the ones that are more sensitive to people saying, let's not bother with air travel. But, in the end, people do want to travel. And if the cost remains reasonable, a lot of big ifs here, you notice, Natasha, that I'm using because all kinds of things are in question, then I think over the long term, we'll see what we've always seen, which people do tend to move on. But again, we've never seen quite anything like this. So we're grasping for precedent, for some lesson from history to guide us. Harder this time than any other time. You think about an airline like Air Canada, as we heard about just before, which thought it had put its tough past behind it finally in recent years, had become a rather strong airline, thought that it could weather any storm, and maybe it could have weathered almost anything, but this just wasn't. When airlines thought about their worst case scenario, this was outside that realm.
You mentioned the impact of 9/11 on the hassle of traveling. So we know what that means. You have to take your shoes off when you're going through security. You can't carry a certain amount of liquid with you. There's all these sorts of necessary precautions that we now have to go through in order to ensure collective safety. So in that same way with COVID-19, or even in the post-COVID-19 world, do you think there's going to be extra security measures that we're going to have to go through in order to enjoy air travel again?
Right. Well, in Canada, as you know, Natasha, masks already mandatory in airports and airlines. In the U.S., it's kind of an airline by airline basis, as with a lot related to COVID-19, less federal guidance on this side of the border. The interesting thing, though, Natasha, is that some of these forces kind of go against each other. Can you imagine, Natasha, showing up at a CATSA checkpoint 3 months ago in a mask and just walking through that way and not having somebody question that, right? It would have been unthinkable. Whereas now that's what everybody's expected to do. They can ask you to take off the mask if they're worried about something, but generally that's the expectation. So you can see how some of the typical safety and security considerations go against some of the health considerations. So there's going to be a sliding scale here in terms of cost and benefit with a lot of things, and in terms of the trade-offs between the benefit of doing something and the cost in another regard when it comes to balancing safety, security, and now health considerations. We are all becoming permanently more germophobic. And so even once we move beyond this immediate threat, again, hopefully sooner than later, things are going to change in some way. And so we'll have to see with these temperature checks that we see Air Canada now doing, privacy concerns among some people on the other hand, really an accounting of what's truly benefiting the public as opposed to giving us just a false sense of security. Hard to say right now. And what are the costs that are worth accepting?
And so, Seth, just before I let you go, what are you going to be watching for in the days, weeks, months ahead when it comes to the airline industry?
Well, first of all, let's see what kind of travel rebounds. A lot of expectations that family visit travel would be the first kind to rebound. I know I was supposed to visit my family down in Florida last month for the holidays, didn't get to do that. Probably the first trip I'll want to take. A lot of people in that kind of situation. So it's reasonable to think that that kind of travel will come back before just the pure leisure travel. I mean, not to mention the fact that Disney World's closed, right? There's some of that kind of travel you can't do. Corporate travel, though, with Zoom and all of this, look, it's been predicted in the past that various other technologies, from the telephone to the fax machine and beyond, would make air travel less necessary. And those predictions generally didn't come true. Some purposes were replaced, but then travel grew in other ways. But again, the biggest crisis, is it different this time? We'll see. Airlines thought it was different this time in a different regard. They thought they had restructured themselves in a way where they wouldn't face these kinds of threats before. That didn't turn out to be the case. Let's see if the predictions of doom and gloom for the airline industry beyond the short term bear out this time as well.
Thank you so much for your time and your analysis, Seth.
Thank you, Natasha. Stay safe.
You too. Seth Kaplan is a transportation analyst with NPR's Here and Now. You're watching CBC News Network.